So, thanks everyone. I think our panelists are going to join us now. So we've got, first of all, Ruth Sanderson. Ruth, for those of you who don't know her, is a broadcaster. She's host of the Brexit Club podcast. We've got Sinead O'Carroll, who is editor at the journal.ie, amongst other things. Peter Gagan, who is a now Glasgow-based but Longford originating journalist, and Sean Doran, who is the founder of Arts Over Borders, which amongst other things created what's now as a whole known as Arts Over Borders in the northwest of Ireland, but includes Freelfest and Happy Days. So thank you everyone for joining. I won't go through their amazing biographies and CVs in detail because it's all covered in the brochure, but suffice to say, everyone on the panel is, I think, uniquely and in different ways qualified to talk about what we're going to talk about. And it will be, I think, hopefully quite a broad and discursive session. So, as Muireann said, whenever we first started talking about this session, it occurred to me, one of the things that put it in my mind was a framed picture I have on the wall of my house in London. I don't live on the island of Ireland anymore, but I come back as much as I can. But it's a map of the Irish railway network in the first decade of the 20th century. And the thing that's really fascinating is the extraordinary dense and intricate level of connectivity between places that you wouldn't really think of being connected today. And the railway network obviously is not what it was on the island of Ireland, not just because of the partition of the island, but also because of technological change and industrial change and all that. But it really made me think about the connections that exist, not just in, actually away from politics, but in our lives, in culture, in sport. And that's why I gathered this amazing crew to talk about it. So I want to just explore some of those thoughts and some of those themes with the panel. And I was going to turn first to Sean, who has quite literally put together an amazing festival, or I guess is it a collection or amalgamation of festivals, Sean, Arts Over Borders. And you put that together to think about the kind of the biographical connectivity of the northwest of Ireland and some of the major figures who have links to that part of the world.
Yeah, well, firstly, say it's lovely to be here. It's the first time I've actually been at the festival, and it's such a beautiful, fantastic festival to experience from this morning. So, yes, in the northwest, I mean, it was as much a surprise to me, to be honest. I was living in Australia at that moment, and it was to do with Samuel Beckett first and foremost. I wanted to create, because having done festivals previously for about 12 years, I had become disillusioned in a kind of way that they weren't rooted to place, or they hadn't an authenticity, to use that much an overused word now. And with Beckett, I turned to him after working at the Opera House and became very obsessed and uplifted, and saw the opportunity of a multi-arts response to him, because technically in the work, the music and the visual arts and other art forms are there. And I didn't know, so the surprise to me was I didn't know he had gone to school as a St. Columb's boy from Derry, that he had gone to school at Royal Portora in Enniskillen, and I visited Enniskillen for the first time as a Derry man, because I left Derry immediately to go to London to train in music. So I'd never been to Fermanagh. We just sort of localised in our North Donegal area, and saw this beautiful island town, saw its very European sense of things, and the Irish Lakelands district, and that there's still waters. I thought that was a fascinating thing, and Beckett was only there from the age of 14 to 17. But I think, as many of us know, those 3 years can be quite, impactful, inchoate years, when within yourself. And when the biographies of Beckett are done, the light bulb goes on when he went to Trinity in Dublin, of course. So Enniskillen or Fermanagh is never mentioned. But we placed it there, and it felt like hand in glove. The single most quoted work in Beckett's work is the King James Bible. The school, Portora School, was founded by King James in 1618, and he had gone there after the First World War in And what we have found out, is that at assemblies every morning, this whole carrying of death was being inculcated to the boys at that time. So you can see, I think what I'm saying, the impact in a place that you can find. There's no trace like there is with Yeats in terms of the experience of writing about a place. But psychically, I think it entered him in terms of rowing on those still waters to a 9th century monastic island and those stone faces that you find on White Island and other places. And then you see his sort of division of body and head. And on those islands, those 9th century gravestones have the decapitated angel's head that, and it says it on the gravestones, they go to heaven first. And if you're to be allowed in, they come back and bring the body. So that turned me, just to finish on that, I'd come from Australia and I had altered through that experience. Again, it was an accident, as mostly everything I've been involved in. And it was the Aboriginal culture that had me to face as a European and arriving in a place with no memory and realizing you had to go back to the blank sheet. And that's where we invented this bio-festival thing to go through the portal of Beckett, but also go through the portal of a place in Enniskillen and put things, put his work in a way where it was heightened better than it would be in a neutral theatre.
And did you think, or have you experienced in the last few years, perhaps people in the south, which I mean the Republic, perhaps in Dublin or elsewhere, being surprised at the placing of Beckett in that context and in that place?
Yeah, well, I mean, with the border, in fact, on the one side of it, it felt like a kind of theft, because and when you spoke to whomever, literary-wise, the knowledge was not there that he had spent those 3 young formative years. But there was also a sense of freedom that it was a fallow terrain in which to, start teasing out in a playful way, I think, particularly with Beckett. That's why the festival works more than anything else. It draws out aspects of him that in a festival environment, when he's done 24 short plays, mostly elsewhere you have to put 3 or 4 or 5, 6 of those together, which he never meant, and got very irritated in a sense about that, because somebody said to him, one of his shortest plays is 30 seconds, and we've done that. Breath, and another one's 3 minutes, and so on. And he said they're full-length works. So in a festival environment, you can spread these out. And so we do the 12-minute play, Ohio Impromptu, in this way of landscape, literary-driven work. And it's 12 minutes, but the audience goes out on the bus. It goes out on the boat, to Devonish, and it's 25 minutes. So the entire event is about an hour and a half or a 12-minute piece. And we do the same with Faith Healer now in West Donegal. Brian Friel kindly, before he left us, gave us permission for the first festival to do Faith Healer in 3 village halls that are 9 kilometres apart, West Donegal, Glenties, Portneuf, Ardara, and up the Glen and Eden Infa. So you have a Wagnerian 5.5-hour epic experience for what is basically an hour and 20-minute play. But that experiential aspect is what draws, I think, the wider audience to experience the work.
And very much kind of immerses them in the place. I think you had if Kira's able, we had a map or that we were going to have a look at if we can get it up.
I thought just to throw it up because and there it is. I know there'll be some scratching and puzzlement now once you start sort of defining and seeing those names and where they lie. Each of the single names actually do lie with one of the 11 border counties, if you consider and should Sligo, let's say, as a border county. It's not literally on the border. But what happens there is you have a constellation, and we sort of mapped this out, and I can't remember how or why, before we started the Single Beckett Festival, that in this territory from the east coast of the town on Louth there, and this has a chronology, and looking across to the southern Mournes that are reputed to be inspired C.S. Lewis's Narnia, and St. Patrick, of course, which is the first written literature of Ireland, and moving through, I mean, there are various associations. Friel lived his entire life there, Heaney, until, he moved to the Republic, and this is the connections between both, and Swift is in there, because up in Loch Gall he spent time, but it was meant to be the moment of when child poverty had sort of forcibly hit him, so it had an impact, and basically you move where the border becomes a binding agent as opposed to a dividing agent, and the sense of culturally, you've got this freedom, of course. You can, when you're producing or curating, to look at that it's not important in terms of the removal of the border. What's important is removing the negativity around the border, and therefore using this as a sort of springboard, basically. The writers of the springboard, they are our seers. I see them in the Aboriginal sense, from Australia, that lead you to the water, effectively, and bringing them forth in a modern way is what we're trying to do.
Now, Sean, the only criticism I have about this map is that some people who know me will know what is that St. Patrick is down in Armagh when he should legitimately be near Downpatrick on the Keel Peninsula there. He seems to be somewhere near Newry. Now, Newry has a big Sainsbury's, which they're entitled to. But St. Patrick, by all rights, should be just a little bit east. But other than that, it's a really wonderful, wonderful bit of imagery.
Absolutely right. And we actually, that was said, and we saw it immediately. So in deference to what you say, we put the snake.
Thank you very much. Well, we are quite serpentine in that part of the world too. Peter, I actually thought, just as Sean was talking there about Enniskillen, you and I have talked a little bit about your kind of cross-border life, as it were, and you've had one in multiple ways, both professionally but also personally. Enniskillen was your kind of one of your near locus points the bigger town growing up in rural Longford. Does what Sean was talking about there and some of those connectivities resonate with you, or did it not resonate in the 80s and 90s?
I think it's really interesting. I must say, I'm not just saying this, Sean, I do think I want to go to your festival. It sounds, I think most people are sitting there going, that sounds absolutely brilliant, getting on going to see the Fate Eater in 3 different places or something like that. And I think it's really interesting to think about the border and to think about the history of that landscape in that way. So when I was growing up, I guess, one of our nearest towns would have been Enniskillen. We'd go over quite a lot to do shopping, things like that. But I was also really struck when I was growing up, we didn't really look north in that way. And I think there's almost this interesting thing of kind of the near border counties, places like Longford that are not on the border, or like Sligo, but are abutting the border. And I think the history and geography of 100 years, we won't go too into politics, we all know what it is, did force a lot of those places to look south in a way. Yeah. And I think what's interesting, I was very conscious when I was growing up of the north. I think probably because I became a journalist, I'm interested in news and things like that. But collectively we didn't. It was the unspoken thing, and it's still. I think it's really interesting, how that has definitely changed in the last 20 years. I guess that's a changing experience for a lot of people. People will cross borders in a way that they hadn't before. But even conceiving of things like that, conceiving McGahern. So we would have seen McGahern as someone from our world, but we wouldn't have seen him within a border context. We'd have seen him in a rural Ireland context. We would have seen him as the writer of kind of kicking against Catholic Ireland in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and part of that metamorphosis, but not seeing him in a context of kind of cross borders. And I think, what I'm really struck by at the moment is why people in the Republic is still, it's still the thing that people don't want to talk about is Northern Ireland. And the B word has given an excuse for people to talk about Northern Ireland, but interestingly in a way that absolves them of having to engage with it as Irish people. Yeah. Somebody else has done this thing, and we're reacting to it now, so we have to think about Northern Ireland in a way that we didn't before. But it's not in a conscious, I feel like it's not in a conscious way of, kind of engagement. There's still eyes roll when people talk about Northern Ireland. And I was very struck when I moved to Belfast. My first proper job was in Derry. I worked on a peace and reconciliation project back in the early 2000s. Back when there was a kind of a boom industry in peace and reconciliation stuff, and it's on. There was, for good reason. And look how successful it's been.
Yes.
You can wander around. It's wonderfully successful.
A bit more.
And I remember I was really struck, and I found I worked on an interface between the Fountain, which is a small loyalist housing estate in Derry, and Bishop Street, which is the kind of largely nationalist in the city side of Derry. And Derry is a fascinating story. There's a lot of darkness about the story of Derry that we don't talk about, like that mass population swap that happened in the early 70s, where we basically all went, it's okay to ethnically, I won't say we're ethnically cleansed, but ethnically divide a large space, and the upshot is there's less violence, so everyone won't talk too much about it. But I was really struck when I was there about, obviously you've got the connection with Donegal, but for people from where I'm from our part of the world, there wasn't that sense that these are spaces in which we wanted to be involved with in any sense. It's I think a lot of people in the Republic still see Northern Ireland within that context of a place apart, of a place that's kind of, it's almost, there's a cringe about it almost. These, and you see it, the kind of this idea of like Nordies, this idea of like kind of people from the north who kind of come down to the Republic and are loud and difficult. And when I was, and
that's just Ruth.
Sorry.
It's just
Sorry,
you,
Peter, I'll apologise.
coming down here with your and that this division is.
They have a point.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that this I was really struck when I started working in this Peace and Reconciliation project. Like people would say to you don't have this stuff in the Republic, and we do. Everybody when I was growing up knew who the Protestants were. You knew where the Protestant school was, and not in a bad. It was just there is a culture and memory of all the things that we think about in Northern Ireland that exist in the Republic, but we don't really kind of face it. Yeah. And I spent a lot of time in my kind of early 20s and my mid 20s living, and then I worked as a reporter in Belfast and spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland. But I was constantly struck by the incuriosity of whenever I would go back home, of people about that experience. They would just kind of treat you as a bit of a curio who's decided to do this strange thing, which is live in Northern Ireland. But the level of engagement was always like that. And it has changed, and people definitely do a lot more cross-border stuff. Like my brother, when he wanted to get his driving test, he went to Enniskillen because the waiting times are quick.
Yes.
My mum goes and gets her teeth done in Enniskillen. like stuff like that is quite handy. We like the ease of, we enjoy the ease of cross-border life now and taking advantages of it. Yeah. But I still think, and I think the last couple of years have really thrown up that difficulty, and the difficulty we have, we won't go, the difficulty we have with conceiving of things about Northern Ireland and conceiving of the future with Northern Ireland, and why we're all quite keen to keep things probably as they are in some sort of stasis with some change. But I think it's because we don't really. A lot of people in the Republic have still struggled to engage with Northern Ireland. And engage with Northern Ireland in its fullness, not a kind of pastiche version of what they think it should be like.
I think it's just a tangible example of that from my daily life. So I'm the editor of the Journal, so it's a digital newsroom, and it's kind of always, and this is long before, I think we're saying the B word now. It's long before
you're allowed,
that,
but
it was very difficult to get people to engage with stories that happened in Northern Ireland. So I'm not talking about Northern Irish stories, not things about Stormont, not things about the political story, like things that physically happened that would engage the public's interest in if they happen in any other county, and they just don't get read. And I have a hypothesis that it's a lot of stories that do capture the public's imagination generally are crime stories. The Gardaí will be involved. People are thinking, God, could that happen to me? Jeez, that was just down the road, or that was a young family, or whoever it has happened to. When you mention the PSNI, oh, that's different.
Yes.
That's them over there. Yeah. And you're immediately creating, by no willful thinking of your own and us and them, oh, that's different. That's not something that can happen. And that's generally how people engage with the news on a daily basis. So I think that's a real tangible example of how in the South we don't actually engage with what happens in Northern Ireland every day.
I'm going to drag you back away from the news and politics for a second, because I think there's a really interesting thoughts. Sinead, you are a former camogie player. You were on a peninsula now, the Dingle Peninsula. As anyone here from County Down will know, that the hurling stronghold in County Down, the only hurling stronghold was the Ards Peninsula, or the bottom end of the Ards Peninsula. And you used to go there and play hurling. Did you find a slightly different version of the North when you went there? Did that reveal something to you that you perhaps weren't aware of?
Well, we used to think, Matthew told me he was from Down, and he was asking about camogie, and I was saying, yeah, you used to always bring us to the absolute end of the world. When you got the fixture list and you had to play against Down, and some years I wasn't playing, I would just go and support my sister, and I'd be going, oh, do I want to go all the way up there? And it was because there was 3 parishes that played camogie right in the peninsula, which was something that we actually never engaged with. I don't think I knew why. We used to just think they brought us there because it was, an away game. The best thing to do is bring the away team to the hardest place that they can find, the most miserable place. They're used to it. They know the pitch, they know the wind, the sea, the grimness. And so we always thought it was that, and never really thought, well, maybe it's because there's only one tiny pocket of camogie and it just happens to be on the peninsula. So no, we didn't really. And growing up, GAA-wise, we would have had loads of trips. I think probably the most we ever engaged with Northern Ireland being different, I guess, was being in Belfast for a competition, and kind of we were in our late teens, so we would have been going out and kind of getting a talking to about the lads weren't allowed to wear their jerseys out, and you know, making sure we were getting back safe. We didn't take any heed of it. It was one of the most crazy nights of my entire life. I think there was a lot of underage drinking and a lot of ignored rules, but I think that's probably the only time in our whole GA life where we would have done a lot of playing up there that we ever really thought about it in a different way.
Which is strange because for a lot of people, particularly people who are involved in the GA in the north, that's in a sense the archetypal, they would think, all-island organisation that, you know, and in a, you know, at times in an explicitly kind of nationalist way, but interestingly that it didn't have always an unlocking effect for you.
No, and I think part of, and I've found the last couple of weeks thinking about the title of this, like connections and disconnections, I think the minute you find a connection, you automatically find a disconnect.
Yeah.
Because if I can connect with somebody in Down because they play camogie, then I'm automatically disconnecting with someone else by saying, well, someone else in Down who doesn't understand that or doesn't do that is automatically disconnecting from them. So I can understand, like when we were saying about, you know, having an apolitical conversation, it's extremely difficult.
Really difficult.
Because the minute you start thinking too deeply about anything you're doing, it automatically sets you up of, oh God, I was thinking of us, and I should have been thinking about us, and I can't do that quite yet.
Yeah, true. Very much so. We talked as well about the you as well as being a news journalist or a sports journalist, and one of a different kind of sporting triumph in the last year or two, because they've had a lot of success recently. Generally, is the Irish women's hockey team, which is an all-island team, and we'll have people from different backgrounds, generally from all kinds of different backgrounds, and that is a sort of success where people are kind of thinking differently about.
Yeah, I think sport, you can, again with sport, you can find as many, like what Sean was saying, you can find really powerful connectors, and I think with the hockey team this year and last year, one of the biggest powerful connectors was it was the first time probably we were seeing women as a team thriving on television screens and thriving with household names. And then one of the other things, and personally I was really connected with it because I grew up playing team sport and I had never seen a team like that on television, and I kind of welled up every time, and it was very embarrassing when I met Chloe Watkins and kind of fangirled all over her and did a lot of that stuff. But afterwards, then I was thinking more, it is an all-island team, and Katie Mullen is the captain. You know, I think there's a lot of stereotypes around hockey. There is definitely in the Republic of Ireland, and you know, it's thought of as a rich Protestant sport a lot. And then there's Katie Mullen, who's from the north and plays camogie, has played camogie in Northern Ireland. So she's breaking down stereotypes by just existing on that hockey team, which I think shows the power of something that can be done. You know, there was very little conversation around that hockey team about, you know, that it was an all-island team, that there was people from all different backgrounds. Yeah. They just kind of did what they did and did it in a really powerful way. But if you think about the ins and outs of it, hockey is a really great example of some of those connections. Like in Rio in 2016, the men Ireland hockey team made the Olympics for the first ever time. I was there covering it and went out to talk to some of the families, and one of the families, the Gleghorns, had a brother playing on the Ireland team and a brother playing with Team GB. And that's very common for people to have gone either direction. So that's breaking down, like, I don't know if they were Catholic or Protestant, I don't know if they were Unionists or Republicans, you know, and there weren't questions to ask. They were just doing their sporting thing.
Yeah. Ruth, you like me are from Down, from the northeast rather than the southwest where we are now.
Mid,
of course, yes, indeed.
Mid.
One of the things you've done had a very wide broadcasting career. One of the things you've looked at is Ulster Scots and the Ulster Scots heritage in the north, and in a strange way, the Ards Peninsula, which we mentioned the Ards Peninsula's hurling heritage, but it also has a very proud Ulster Scots heritage. In a strange way, it's almost like we're in a Gaeltacht peninsula down here. There's a different kind of linguistic peninsula up there. Is there? I'd be interested in your thoughts on how those two things are connected.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I must apologise, I've got a horrendous cold and I'm going to have to blow my nose at some point, and I'm going to sound like the Crash Ensemble because I can't take this off. Be like that per trombonist who I thought was going to have a heart attack by the end of it. Yeah, no, I think all of that's really, really interesting. And I was fascinated to see that literary map. And there's just a big bald spot in Antrim. And that's kind of, Ulster Scots land, and Ard's Peninsula is Ulster Scots land.
I think in fairness, it's because the border. It's because their border. Is that right, Sean?
There's a border
Yeah.
counties, yes, but it's so obvious. Yeah, it leaves Belfast out.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think there it is. I think nothing happens up there at all. But Ulster Scots is a really interesting, I think, example of arts and culture on the island of Ireland that is a very hard thing to put your finger on or to feel ownership of if you're not from that part of the world. So, typically it's associated with Protestants from the north coming down with their voices, and it's associated with a particular cultural history and a particular probably socio-economic history as well as being, it's kind of the farming language. And if you ever have heard anybody say shuck or uxter or forby, like a lot of Ulster Scots words and vernacular is really common in Northern Irish parlance. And it doesn't really matter which side of the community you come from, you're likely to say a word like that. But it's also something that I think a lot of people really recoil from because of its, its inability to place itself outside the historical, political. Because if you're associated with Ulster Scots, you have to be associated with Orangism or Protestantism or Presbyterianism, whereas actually I think that's a real shame because there's a really rich tradition there of language. You just need to think about the Weaver poets, and I think as well for a lot of Northern Ireland, that disconnection with the south probably happens in a similar way with the south to the north in terms of proximity. Like, on the Ard's Peninsula, you're 12 miles from Scotland. That was the natural trading route to get back and forth. So, of course, there's going to be commonality in language and in culture. I was saying to my husband this morning, I've never been to Kerry, but I've been to the west coast of Scotland more times than I can think of. And I think that connection is still there. And I don't necessarily think that's a political one. I think that's a geographical one.
Do you think people, this is a slightly strange question, how do you think people in, for example, Dingle, not that we need to go out into the street or into this room and kind of encourage people to go and kind of engage with Ulster Scots, but do you think there's a kind of, is it a disinterest or a sort of like resistance to engaging with it, or what's the, or perhaps I should be asking someone else in the panel?
Well, no, maybe, but I think there's been a slight embarrassment about it. I think certainly when I present a programme on BBC Northern Ireland, and it's about Ulster Scots heritage and culture.
It's called HAME. You can give it a plug.
It's called HAME. You might find that difficult to translate into English. I think there's been a reticence to recognise it as a legitimate thing. I think because as a language it is very akin to English and there are a lot of similar words, but also because of that politicisation.
You saw Arlene Foster tweet it
I
during
saw
the week,
that.
and it was actually really interesting to see the responses were really unfairly scathing, and it wasn't just towards a politician, it was towards the heritage and the language, and saying, this isn't a real thing, I can go do that. So she had gone to get a certificate to say that she could speak Ulster Scots, and you can go online and do a test, and people were going on
it's called your Weena Words.
Weena Words, yeah.
There you go.
And people are going on like, I've never even heard of this and I can pass it, but really disrespectful actually.
Yeah, and I think that is, it's got a big PR problem. But I think, and I was when I was first approached to present it, I was really reticent too, because I'm not into kind of that extreme side of culture, even though I grew up in that world. But I sort of had to wind my neck in because I thought if we don't talk about this, if we can't explore a heritage and a culture that is as much part of the Irish experience on the island of Ireland as the Gaeltacht is, then what are we doing? That's why it gets siloed off. That's why there is a disconnection between groups about that. But I think there's value in it. Because I think
Is it the word I think we are struggling to not say the word the politics, talk about politics.
Peter, you're the first to crack.
You're
so bad at it.
I know, it's normally me, Peter, but you...
I'm so bad. But it's interesting, the Ulster Scots thing is really interesting, because in Scotland, there's been a whole Scots conversation, and it's all about class, really. If you go to the west of Scotland, go to Glasgow, people speak in Scots. And it's a class aspect, and the history of that is a history of people kind of having it literally beaten out of them in school. But it's a different type of story, and it would be an Irish Catholic Scottish story as much as an Irish Protestant Scottish story and a West of Scotland story in general. But I think there's that aspect of it too, whereas because it's become so pulled out and stuck within a certain ethno-nationalist context or political context, it loses all of that. And I think that's the thing that's really difficult with it too. I think for a lot of people to engage with something, because it's got drawn into that, it means it's much harder for people to kind of go, actually, this is about, which I do think they've tried to do in Scotland, which is to pull it out and say, well, this is actually the language of people. This is, and which it is in Northern Ireland too. It is a language of people in specific geographical areas, which is fascinating. And it shouldn't be something that's stamped down upon. But it's so interesting to see the different support networks that exist in Scotland and Northern Ireland for what is basically the same, root language is really, really interesting.
I think that's a really, really good point. I think the class issue is a really good point as well, and how that has, and Ulster Scots certainly in the north, I think, has been hijacked in a way by certain interested groups who almost as a I think because in the rest of Ireland there is such a strong, rich literary tradition, linguistic tradition, that it's almost like in the north, oh, I'll take this and this is ours and we've got this and we're as valid as you because we've got this. Whereas actually it's all valid. It's not a competition about whose heritage is more valid. We're such a mixed up mongrel nation that...
And I guess that speaks back to the border thing as well. It's the obsession with putting things into the north and into the south.
Whereas actually Ulster Scots is we did a series recently about the border counties because it was, all of Ulster, basically. So we're in Raphoe and in Cavan and in, wherever. And it's interesting, actually, coming then, that links into what you're saying about hockey. We went to a school in Raphoe, and it was, I think, the kind of local Protestant school, and they had a guys' hockey team. And I grew up, no offence, I grew up hating hockey in school. We did it.
Talk to my dad. He used to come every Saturday and pull his hair out.
Oh my goodness, no. My shins have never recovered from it, actually. And this team, I think their closest match was like 2 hours away. It was like a 2-hour drive to Cookstown to have a local match. And that, to me, I suddenly realised that's really isolating. Actually, coming from the north where... every non-Catholic school, I guess, plays hockey. I suddenly realised, wow, this is the reverse here.
Yeah, and people think. Sean, just to go back to what we were just describing, which is this thing about putting things in boxes and the border being a barrier rather than a thing that kind of connects people. Do you think that? What more do you think can be done? Having already done quite a lot with Arts Over Borders, what more do you think? Are there models from your experience with Arts Over Borders that could be applied to for example, most sporting bodies are actually all island, but other areas of life? Do you think?
Well, I think listening to what was being discussed and how the border is so divisive. And I came back from Australia, so I've been 5 years there, and so that's in 2011, 12. But I really felt the psychological division of that border. And Tourism Northern Ireland did assessments in the early years of the festival. 40% of our audience came from the Republic, which was, but that would be as far south as well as Dublin and elsewhere. But anecdotally, so many were saying, actually, this is the first time I've actually come north, and this is in 2012, and certainly the first time being in Fermanagh. The aspects of, what Kate was talking earlier about unspoken communication, I don't think we even have an unspoken communication of fraternity between the northern part and the southern part. It's kind of just left to be as is. And when I arrived, in the sense of spending 30 years elsewhere, just following where the work was invited me to, I realized when I came back very strikingly that there was a feeling you don't have permission to do things enough of world-class level or better than elsewhere. And it is a place, I think, and for my home city, it's built by individuals, extraordinary individuals. I think in Northern Ireland across, there is a state aspect to it that is very much a dead hand. It's just the way it is when you have 40 years of trouble. So how you helped forward on that, and the external of bringing outsiders, cultural tourism it's called, in and mixing. I saw it, and it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life, the sense of ownership of the festival, the embracing of it, and then the asking each year, is the festival coming back? Not in the sort of way, will it come back? I'm looking forward to it. Just not believing, how could it possibly come back? Because things don't come back if they're good. Therefore, I think it requires a really dedicated all-island. There was a phrase, actually, and sorry, this is why I brought the book, but I did want to read it very quickly at some point, because there was a Guardian who came over, and I hadn't known Brian Friel, hadn't picked up on it, said this in 1980 when he was writing translations, and this year we had done The Freedom of the City, the Bloody Sunday play, but it's about, working class poverty as much, and the audience would come across from Ebrington Barracks by a black spiritual singer, or from the Bloody Sunday Museum. But she found this when she reported that he said in 1980 when he was in the Guildhall and co-founding Field Day, he said, politics are so obtrusive here. For people like ourselves, definitions of identity have to be developed and analysed much more frequently than in England. We've got to keep questioning until we find some kind of generosity that can embrace the whole island. As with Friel, and, it's so beautifully put. And we can't mention the B word or anything like that, of course. But
you can mention it, just don't dwell on it.
Which is unusual for me. Yeah, I just hope enough balls, whatever they are, are thrown up in the air enough where things can be malleable. So to start seeing something that could suddenly take the chance and the opportunity that from hardened ground we haven't been for so long.
I think one of the things that's coming out is this sense of certainly, and I can speak from a northern perspective, is a desire almost to, it doesn't necessarily mean political change or constitutional change, but a sense of, a desire for that sense of fraternity or kind of acknowledgement or even ownership from the south at times. So that's certainly something I would have felt. But one of the interesting possibly examples of that in the last few years, and I'd be interested to get everyone's thoughts on it, is activism. And activism in a different kind of way than we might have seen in decades gone past. Perhaps not activism in a kind of green-orange sense, but in terms of the social change that's happened in the Republic. Sinead, you've obviously covered this a lot as a journalist. Has it been notable or noticeable to you, first of all, the involvement of Nordies, as it were, in the equal marriage referendum, and then the repeal referendum, and then the obverse in terms of activism back up north?
Yeah, I think it was probably most telling the day after the Eighth Amendment referendum, because there was a very real sense of relief in Ireland, but then almost immediately, I think everyone started talking immediately among those activism groups of, okay, Northern Ireland, this needs to be an all-island solution to what, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but what was deemed to be a problem, this is actually, we need an all-island solution. And it was very much, Simon Harris, Health Minister, was being asked questions about it all through the referendum, what will happen to Northern Ireland? If there are women in Northern Ireland who want to seek abortion services, can they come here? And that was, even before the Eighth Amendment had been repealed, they were the questions being asked of the Health Minister. So it definitely was probably one of the first, again, going back to non-Northern Irish stories, that people were bringing in Northern Ireland into the conversation without it being forced. And I think even then, when it did happen through Westminster, there was very little political conversation around that either. Like Conor McGinn obviously was involved. He was from Northern Ireland initially, so probably helped that some of it didn't feel like a hijacking or using a system or abusing a system. But it was definitely an example where we weren't trying to put things in a box, in a Northern Ireland box and in a Republic of Ireland box and in a Westminster box, that it was actually one conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you were going to go in there, Peter. Something
yeah,
on,
well,
on
I
the
thought it was really
activist
interesting with the 8th referendums. I think it was the first time I've ever seen something happen in the Republic of Ireland that actually started a conversation in Westminster, or started a conversation in British politics about Ireland in a way that wasn't about orange and green stuff. It forced. I remember Stella Creasy was very vocal as well. We've seen since legislative change in Northern Ireland at the back of it, and I thought that was really fascinating because we've always, it's always historically been something happens in Northern Ireland and Britain, London and Dublin react to it in some sort of way that's to do with certain interests, strategic interests of the nation states. Whereas this was something happening in the Republic of Ireland that was, and it was about a very different issue, and it was forcing a conversation to happen. Because that was how I was in London at the time. That was a conversation that was really happening then in London on the back of it as well, and across the United Kingdom. And the Scottish government came out and said that they would offer free care for Northern Irish women. There was a big, and I think I think that's the kind of thing that, that's the kind of change that needs to happen. They're the kind of conversations that I think lead to kind of a different way of thinking about what happens in the whole island.
Although I think, interestingly, that conversation was probably stronger elsewhere than it was in Northern Ireland. I think that in Northern Ireland, we are working at a different time scale to the rest of Ireland and the rest of the UK. We're still an incredibly conservative society. And with the B word, you see that in terms of trying to come to terms with what identity is. And we weren't ready to do that. And that's why, I think you've seen a polarisation. And I think likewise with abortion and same-sex marriage, I think Northern Ireland has been on a journey that has, it's been, I guess, led by a deeply religious society, very conservative society, and one that probably wasn't quite ready to go there. And because of what happened in the South and because of the lack of government, you kind of had that being imposed in Northern Ireland, which put a lot of people's backs up, because, yes, on one hand, people think, this is great, and actually long time, of course, we've been behind in everything. Of course this should have happened, when legislation came in the late 60s in the rest of the UK, we wouldn't be having this conversation, but it didn't. And it's interesting now, just gauging, people are kind of trying to feel their way around it slightly.
That's probably some of the disconnect then as well,
definitely.
that we actually don't really know the conversation that was happening in Northern Ireland, because it's probably difficult to get people to go on air to discuss it, therefore it's not coming down and we're not actually hearing it. It's actually just happening in the pubs.
It's all people discuss on air. Oh yeah, that's all people want to talk about up north.
Is there no problem as well, because I'm always really struck. If I, about a year ago, I spent a couple of days with a lot of loyalists in the Shankill Road doing a big story, and I was really struck because I wonder sometimes, is Northern Ireland as religious as its leaders project? Because what I'm really struck is when I have those conversations, say in East Belfast or in West Belfast. Those people actually, on social issues, are actually the exact same as people across the island. There's the Irish Language Act. We won't go into that side of it, that they really have a problem with. But, I wonder sometimes, is that really representative, of Northern Ireland?
Or is there actually... I think outside of the city, definitely. And I think that Northern Ireland outside of its cities is a very conservative place and is very much Bible Belt. And... yeah, I think that definitely in places that you're visiting, less so. And you're right that the kind of social conservatism isn't quite as much, say, up the Shankill, ironically, as it would be in middle-class North Antrim. Yeah.
And that brings us on actually to a question I wanted to reflect on, something that we talked about before. At Ireland's age and people are talking about it everywhere, is the question of the city, and the city kind of separating itself from other parts of societies. Are Dublin and Belfast were quite dominant in the context of the respective jurisdictions on the island. Is there an opportunity there? Should Dublin and Belfast be more closely linked in kind of cultural terms? How could that happen? And is that a risk, do you think? I'm going to start with you, Ruth.
I think they are more closely linked than they were, and I think not having a border there has done wonders for that. I think the two have probably always been quite linked in terms of industry and, getting the bus or the train up and down.
Yeah.
But should they be more closely linked? They're very different places. I mean, my sense of Dublin is it's this very cosmopolitan, almost Scandinavian city. And Belfast is, I was talking to a Dutch journalist yesterday, and I had to reel myself in, because he was kind of slagging Belfast off a bit. He was like, yeah, it isn't so special. It's okay for me to say that. You're not allowed to say it. But, it's like Norwich, basically, or somewhere. It's kind of like a small provincial city. I think one thing that has increased is probably tourism. And I think, that's probably off the back of wonderful festivals like yours, Sean, but also I think because there were so many tourists in the south, there's probably a bit of a push to get some up north, if just to give you a bit more space.
There's a good business case for it, so it makes sense. And 2 hours up the road, we built that nice
Go
motorway.
to the Titanic Museum. There's nothing around it, but you can go there and learn about a great tragedy. That's fun for everyone.
Exactly, yes.
We had a hand in this great boat.
It was fine when it left here.
Yes, indeed. Or you can learn about the Troubles, or you can learn about George Best, a footballer who
George, great.
Sort of tragic,
take a selfie with some murals.
Took a selfie with the murals.
But I suppose that's I probably, and I should phrase my question better, which is, should people from Dublin? I've deliberately, and I was talking to people on the panel before this. No one on this panel, including myself, is from either Dublin or Belfast. And I think I'm interested in that because I think the two cities kind of predominate in people's perspectives of the respective jurisdictions. But Sinead, my question to you is, should more people who live in Dublin or other parts of the Republic, but particularly Dublin, go to Belfast and experience it not just politically, but culturally, socially?
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the other disconnects about saying, like, how often we go there. I was saying, like, I would have gone there a lot as a kid, but only because of the GA. I'm not sure how many times I would have been in Northern Ireland if it wasn't for going to camogie matches or going to see Kildare play football. Like, I'm not sure. So there's probably a body of work to be done there, but it is, I think, cultural things like what Sean is doing that is going to provide those moments and wider sporting moments. I just finished the Donald McRae's boxing book, In Sunshine and in Shadow, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of my favourite books of the year, but focuses a lot on what Barry McGuigan was able to do and the people who would have attended his fight. So it's probably in a similar way, but in a much stronger way, because I think obviously the GA is has a big dividing factor, and in a way that boxing didn't, that it was seen as a cross-community sport, that people worked across both communities all the way through the Troubles, and people went to watch fights in different areas, and I think people from the south went up to Northern Ireland. So I think it needs, like, Northern Ireland needs things like that, and we need to embrace them as all island things and stop putting people in boxes. Yes. Just to use another sporting example, we were all dying to put Rory McIlroy into are you Irish, are you British, are you Northern Irish, and we wanted him to stand up and declare it, even though we should have learned from people like Barry McGuigan, who was from Clones, fought in the Commonwealth Games, fought for the British title. We had an example from the 80s of someone who did it well, who wore a dove on his shorts, and then we're still now in the 2000s begging people to put themselves in a box and divide communities rather than bring them together. So I think there's a lot of work then. I think sport could learn from the cultural things that are happening, and as individuals we can learn from that as well.
Peter, you are someone who spent a fair bit of time in the North, and whenever I wrote something for the Irish Times a few months ago, I remember specifically that you told the one gig you could remember going to in Belfast was Godspeed You Black Emperor, who are a great act. But should people from the Republic be making an effort? I mean, it seems a bit kind of perhaps overdone to be telling people to literally go north, but what would you be telling people about Belfast? Why should they go and visit?
I think there is a start. Obviously, infrastructure is a huge thing. I drove to Derry a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
This summer I ended up spending a bit of time back home in Longford. I spent quite a lot of time in Fermanagh as well during the summer, and I must have crossed that border 7 or 8 times.
Yeah.
And the road is it's cliche, but the road is absolutely abysmal.
It's dreadful,
it's terrible. You have to go through these tiny. It has not improved at all since the Troubles. It's terrible. It took an hour to travel about 25 miles, and it took hours to go up to Derry. It took about 3 hours from where, and it's not that far. It really isn't that far. And I think that's a really difficult thing. But I think it's by improving that kind of connectivity that helps. Because I was staying in Belle-Isle, this lovely castle in South Fermanagh. It was lovely. I got to swim in Lough Erne every day, and I had a lovely time. It was very, very, very nice.
Like David Cameron, in fact, who famously swam in Lough Erne, but we're not talking about him or anything.
Yeah, but what was really, I was actually saying to a friend of mine, I was staying in this castle. He goes, actually, we were looking at that for our wedding. We ended up getting married in Galway, and I thought that was interesting because that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. He wouldn't have gone and looked at no one would have. You never would have said to a wedding of a bunch of kind of Catholics in the Republic, we're going to go to Fermanagh. It just wouldn't have happened. So, but I think that's part of it too. I'm not saying let's build tons of roads, but there needs to be like you started off talking about the connectivity of rail. It's just so disconnected, but also in the way Northern Ireland is disconnected too, east-west. I think people in the Republic don't realise just how disconnected the ban is.
Yeah.
East and west of the ban are so radically different, and I think that's part of it too. I think the city-state idea is quite interesting because we see it in the Republic that Dublin is such an obvious city-state and so different to. I don't live in Ireland. I haven't lived in Ireland for 15 years. Every time I come back to Ireland, I'm so struck by how different and unrepresentative Dublin is of the rest of Ireland. Increasingly, I think it's fair to say.
And how different Dublin is now than when it was.
Completely. When I went to college, it's a night and day. Whereas when I went to college, it felt like, and I've lived a lot of time. I've spent a lot of years living in Glasgow. Glasgow feels like a representative city of Scotland, the way that Dublin doesn't of Ireland.
Right. Okay.
But I think there's a huge and there's an element of that in Northern Ireland too. And I think people in the Republic don't realise. I think we can kind of slightly fixate on the north-south thing and not think that much about what does that mean, the east-west aspect of within the island.
Completely.
And it's really difficult, just in terms of geography, Derry, there's still no decent road from Belfast to Derry. You still get stuck in the Glenshane Pass in winter.
Oh,
and
spring,
that's crazy.
it's summer.
It's a terrible journey.
It's rain and you're done.
That will help, Conor. That will help as well. I think there's a our fixation on building city-states. We've imitated the British disease.
Right.
London has sucked Britain.
Yes.
London sucks Britain in the same way that Belfast and Dublin are sucking, life out of bits of Ireland. I think, and I think there's that way of thinking about the world almost is part of it.
Very much so.
Yeah,
And Sean, you have a particular, though you're now based in London, northwest of Ireland perspective on that, and Derry as, in a sense, what was a city-state for the northwest of Ireland a century ago, but has kind of lost that for various reasons. What would you like to see in terms of people from all over the island going to the northwest and understanding both sides of the border, I guess?
Well, I was going to say, actually, I would prefer to see Dublin people go to Donegal, rather than go to Belfast. Not rather, but the sense of the distance and not going to Donegal and how Donegal is so cut off within this fixture of things, and with the B word again, for Donegal, that's the place to focus on if you wanted to gift some sense of, inclusion and engagement like that. But you can't just ask or propose for people to obviously go.
Much as I'd like to.
They have to go something to go to.
Yeah.
And even with the Titanic, how wondrous that is. I mean, it's coachloads. I think mostly, my understanding is in, out. So the impact is not there. So it's not to go there with eyes wide open would be the thing. And how do we create that cultural fluidity, of stagnant waters between the island and the two parts? I don't know. I mean, each of us do it in their own individual rights, but have no sense of what you can do. And Belfast, I think, a problem that we've had is it's a euphemism for Northern Ireland.
Yes.
That's something that has to come unstuck, because Belfast does look east. There's no question about it. Historically, that's fine and all that. So therefore, the West gets doubly neglected in that sense. But there is a rest of Northern Ireland. Population-wise, it's divorced from it because it's smaller. But that has to be resolved somehow within itself.
And
Northern
that's
Ireland
part of our disconnect as well. Even if you go back to our education as down here, what do you learn about the geography of Northern Ireland? Not not very much, you know. You get the big lakes and kind of where they're situated, but besides like what the county names are, that there'd be a lot of towns and places that you wouldn't know from your schooling, which you would when they're in the south. So even that, like, where do you go? Like, if you are asking like to go somewhere outside of Belfast or to see Northern Ireland as wider than just Belfast, when that's all you've seen on the news, that's all you've picked up from your surroundings.
The answer to that is Downpatrick, of course, my hometown. If you want to talk about coach news of people stopping off to look at St. Patrick's grave and then getting back in the bus.
The coach.
And then sadly, yes, getting back in the coach. So what do you think, Ruth, in terms of how we get people to move around the island? We've talked about getting people to go north. Do you think you talked about this being your first visit to Kerry. Do you think people in the north from and I don't just mean Ulster Scots Protestants, I mean people from all backgrounds, of all faiths and none, and all backgrounds and none, to go to other parts of the island and think about their connectivity to it?
I think there's a lot more movement than there used to be. I mean, you talk about Donegal, it's kind of a northern exodus into Donegal every summer, But yeah, no, I think there is much more of a movement. I think being over 60 helps.
Yes, indeed, you free bus pass.
I just think about my parents and this who are in Dublin every weekend, kind of having a gay old time for free. You know, I think that helps. I think definitely east-west is a big problem, and I think that is the thing that we don't talk about or focus on, because it's so easy to do a north-south generalisation, but east and west is a problem, and getting people from the east of Northern Ireland to Derry is probably more difficult than getting people to Dublin or getting people to, Cork even. So I think it definitely happens more, but I think, I think as Sean was saying, if you are in the northeast, your natural kind of positioning is to jump on a plane or jump on a boat. And to go...
It's easier sometimes.
Because it's easier.
Yeah.
I mean, it took, all of yesterday to get here from Newry. Which is fine, because all I can do at the minute is sit down and eat sandwiches. So it was a perfect day for me. But yeah, it's not straightforward. And then you look at somewhere like England, where you can be on the M5, the M2, whatever, and get places quite quickly. But it's interesting, you're pointing that I think about what do you learn about the geography of Northern Ireland. I would say in the north that's a similar thing. What do you learn about the geography of the south? Where do you learn where things are? It's very much, focused on our own little
or even
patch.
what places are known for.
Yeah.
And I think that probably goes to my initial point of like the news element of like things when they happen in certain towns, that just, it doesn't bother people. They're like, oh, I don't know where that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, move on. Next story.
There's a kind of a lack of ownership or a lack of sense of fraternity. So I'm going to turn to everyone. So one final thought on the place in a place on the island of Ireland. This idea to ask people this just occurred to me as I was talking about the place you'd like to visit. I'll start with Sean.
Yeah.
Given that we're all talking about places and places where if there's somewhere you'd like to visit that you haven't been yet,
But I haven't been.
and it can be either north or south.
Well, I was very lucky early on because in the 80s I was involved in writing the Rough Guide, so I got to know to Ireland quite a bit of what I didn't know. But if there was somewhere particular to want, I'd like to go into the interior. The Midlands was talked earlier. There, as you say, about Longford, and Michael Keegan Dolan, one of my great heroes, comes from that, one of the great geniuses of the arts. So yeah, I would like to go deep nowhere without summoning.
There's lots of deep nowhere.
There's a lot of deep nowheres, but the beauty of that in the north now we're talking about for people to go, saying to go to, is the Seamus Heaney home place in Balahi.
Yeah.
There it is in the centre of, that was always the place of nowhere, but it's in the middle of everywhere
Yeah.
now. So yeah.
I should say, by the way, I didn't even warm the panel up that they were going to get this question,
No.
and that's why I went to Sean first. I'll do mine. I'll do mine last, so I get most time to think. But I think the Midlands is a really good one, because I spent last New Year. My wife's in the audience. We spent last New Year and I actually got tips from you, Peter. I spent in County Leitrim in John McGahern country, and that was a place that I had basically other than someone decided to book a house there and rent it for years with very little reason to go there, but I got to explore John McGahern country. Peter, where would you like to visit?
I'm going to steal this from probably, I think, the finest interpreter of Northern Ireland for an audience both in the Republic of Ireland, but on the rest of the UK is Susan McKay, who's a good friend of mine, who was talking to me a lot this weekend about Rathlin Island. And she's been singing Rathlin Island's praises. So Susan has definitely inspired me to want to go to Rathlin.
Oh, it is.
So so that's my place I've not been yet, that I think I'm going to try and get a visit to soon. Although she did tell me also that Kate Hoey has a house on Rathlin Island.
I've seen, yes, that's the reason.
Which is slightly, sorry about the politics.
No, that's fine.
Slightly,
You're allowed. You're allowed when it comes to
Slightly, I know. Imagine like waking up in the morning and like Kate Hoey's outside.
Presumably, if you check her Twitter feed.
Yeah, they're on the island as well, you know.
Presumably, if she's been tweeting, that means she's not on Rathlin because she's got Wi-Fi.
Yeah, there's no reception.
So if she's tweeting, you can go. Sinead, where's your?
They were good ones, weren't they? I actually would like to go to Sean's festival. I think we're all agreed on that. I mentioned that book that I have just read, and I actually would love to go to Jerry Story's gym in. So that was the famous Holy Family boxing gym, and he's still alive. He's 83 now, I think, and I would love just to see him in action, because I think some of his work, his cross-community work, has now, and my hobby horse is, trying to get as many women to feel like that they have much opportunity in sport as young boys do, and he's now coaching young girls to box, and he's really enjoying that aspect of, like, that new aspect of his life. So I would like to go there and just see a session with Jerry.
Excellent. Ruth?
I feel like I spend my life travelling around Ireland, north and south, usually to farms and standing in the wind in places. Where'd I like to go? I'll echo Rathlin, but Tory Island. I've been to Rathlin a few times and it is amazing. Although Kate Hoey.
I know. It is a bit of it's a tough one to get over.
Mightn't be back.
I did say Tory does count as politics, so I won't anyway.
That's quite interesting. Kate Hoey, Tory Island.
Indeed,
sorry.
yes, very good. And I will finish by saying something really boring, which is that the place I will go to is
Lurgan.
Yes, indeed, Lurgan, for some Lurgan champion. No, well, in a few weeks' time, I started by talking about railways, and in a few weeks' time, it's Christmas. And at Christmas time, there's one of the few the best preserved heritage railway on the island of Ireland is my hometown, Downpatrick. And I'm going to take my son on the heritage railway to go and visit Santa Claus. So that's the place I'm looking forward to going. And that is my very twee way of finishing. Well, it's been a really wonderful session. The time is up. We've gone over time. Nuala is looking at me to tell me that we need to get off the stage. But thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to our wonderful panel.
Thank you.